The smell of damp earth and smoke filled the air, a pungent mix that stung the nostrils and conjured images of desolation. The sound of artillery fire echoed through the frozen landscape, a constant reminder of the chaos that had engulfed this once peaceful land. The cold was biting, a bitter wind that cut through even the thickest of coats, leaving exposed skin numb and vulnerable. It was a bleak winter, one that seemed to have no end, and the war that raged on only served to exacerbate the misery. As the snow crunched beneath heavy boots, the silence between explosions was oppressive, punctuated only by the distant rumble of tanks and the occasional burst of machine gun fire. The sky above was a deep, foreboding gray, a color that seemed to suck the very life out of the world. It was a somber mood, one that hung over the battlefield like a shroud, weighing heavily on the hearts of those who fought. The year was 1944, and the world was embroiled in a conflict that seemed to have no end. The Allies had finally gained a foothold in Europe, but the road to victory would be long and arduous. The Germans, though weakened, still had a significant presence on the continent, and their determination to hold on to what was left of their conquests was unwavering. The war in the East, meanwhile, raged on, with the Soviet Union pushing the Germans back towards their own borders. In the midst of this chaos, a young soldier barely out of his teenage years huddled in a foxhole, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. His name was Jack, and he had been drafted into the army just a few months ago. The reality of war was still a shock to him, the sounds, the smells, the constant fear of death or injury. He had seen things that no one should ever have to see, and yet he had been lucky so far, escaping the worst of it with only a few minor scratches. As he peered into the distance, Jack's mind wandered back to his family, to the warm and cozy home he had left behind. He thought of his mother, always cooking up a storm in the kitchen, the smell of fresh-baked bread wafting through the air. He thought of his father, a stern but fair man, who had always been there to offer guidance and support. And he thought of his sister, a precocious young girl, always getting into mischief, always making him laugh. The sound of an explosion jolted Jack back to reality, and he ducked down into the foxhole, his heart racing. The artillery fire was getting closer, and he knew that he and his fellow soldiers had to be careful. They were part of a larger unit, tasked with holding a strategic position, but the Germans were pushing hard, trying to break through the lines. Jack's unit had been stationed here for weeks, and the constant bombardment was taking its toll. They were tired, hungry, and cold, but they knew that they couldn't give up. As the day wore on, the fighting only intensified. The sound of gunfire and explosions grew louder, and the smell of smoke and sweat hung heavy in the air. Jack's unit was pinned down, unable to move, as the Germans launched a fierce attack. The young soldier's heart was racing, his senses on high alert, as he waited for the enemy to make their next move. He knew that the coming hours would be crucial, that the outcome of the battle would determine the course of the war, and as he huddled in the foxhole, his rifle at the ready, Jack couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Would he make it home alive, or would he become just another statistic in the long and bloody conflict? Only time would tell. As the war escalated, military strategists on both sides began to employ innovative tactics to gain the upper hand. The introduction of trench warfare, for instance, forced commanders to rethink their approach to battle. Traditional methods of advancing in lines and relying on cavalry charges were no longer effective, and a new era of static warfare emerged. The use of machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery further complicated the situation, making it increasingly difficult for troops to break through enemy lines. From a geopolitical perspective, the conflict had far-reaching implications. The alliances formed prior to the war, such as the Triple Entente and the Central Powers, played a significant role in shaping the global landscape. The war drew in multiple nations, including the United States, which initially maintained a policy of neutrality before eventually entering the conflict. The involvement of these new players led to a shift in the balance of power, as countries like the United States and Japan began to assert their influence on the world stage. The war also saw the rise of new military leaders, who would go on to shape the course of modern warfare. Generals like Erwin Rommel, George S. Patton, and Bernard Montgomery became household names, renowned for their tactical genius and strategic thinking. Their approaches to battle, which emphasized mobility, air power, and combined arms, would later influence military doctrine and inform the development of modern military tactics. The importance of logistics and supply chain management also became apparent during this period. The ability to maintain a steady flow of troops, equipment, and supplies to the front lines, was crucial in determining the outcome of battles. The development of new technologies, such as tanks, aircraft, and radar, further exacerbated the need for effective logistical support. The side that could most efficiently manage its resources and coordinate its efforts would ultimately gain a significant advantage on the battlefield. In addition to the military tactics employed during the war, the conflict also had a profound impact on the global economy. The widespread destruction and loss of life led to a significant decline in international trade, as nations focused on supporting their own war efforts rather than engaging in commercial activities. The war also led to a rise in nationalist sentiment, as countries began to prioritize their own interests over international cooperation. This shift in focus would have lasting consequences, contributing to the decline of globalization and the rise of protectionist policies in the decades that followed. The war's impact on civilians was also significant, as the distinction between military and civilian targets became increasingly blurred. The introduction of aerial bombing and the use of chemical weapons raised questions about the ethics of modern warfare and the need for international regulations to protect non-combatants. The humanitarian crises that arose as a result of the conflict, including the displacement of millions of people and the spread of disease, would later inform the development of international humanitarian law and the establishment of organizations like the Red Cross. As the war entered its final stages, the geopolitical landscape continued to evolve. The Russian Revolution, which took place in 1917, marked a significant turning point, as the new Soviet government withdrew from the conflict and began to pursue its own agenda. The impact of this event was felt across the globe, as the spread of communist ideology and the rise of the Soviet Union as a major world power would go on to shape international relations for decades to come. The war's conclusion, marked by the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, would also have far-reaching consequences, contributing to the rise of nationalist sentiment in Germany and laying the groundwork for the outbreak of another global conflict just 2 decades later. As the sun set over the battle-scarred landscape, the opposing forces began to dig in for the long haul, their artillery and machine guns at the ready. The Germans, with their formidable blitzkrieg tactics, had thrown everything they had at the Allied lines, but the defenders had held firm. Now, as the night wore on, the Allies prepared to launch a counterattack, one that would push the Germans back and reclaim the initiative. The Allies' arsenal was impressive, with the M4 Sherman tank forming the backbone of their armored divisions. Weighing in at around 35 tons, the Sherman was a beast of a machine, powered by a 400 horsepower Ford V8 engine, and capable of reaching speeds of up to 26 miles per hour. Its 75mm M3 gun was a reliable workhorse, capable of firing a variety of ammunition types, including armor-piercing, high-explosive, and smoke rounds. But the Germans were not to be underestimated, and their own armor was more than a match for the Sherman. The Panther tank, with its sleek, sloping hull and powerful 700 horsepower Maybach engine, was a formidable opponent, capable of reaching speeds of up to 34 miles per hour. Its 75mm KWK-42 gun was a precision instrument, with a muzzle velocity of over 3,000 feet per second and a range of over 2 miles. As the two armies clashed, the air was filled with the roar of engines, the staccato burst of machine guns, and the under-carious boom of artillery. The battlefield was a chaotic, deadly place, where one misstep could mean instant death. The Allies' logistics chain was stretched to the breaking point, with supply lines snaking back across the English Channel to the depots and warehouses of Britain. The Germans, on the other hand, were fighting on their own turf, with the advantage of interior lines and a shorter supply chains. Despite these advantages, the Germans were beginning to feel the strain. Their fuel supplies were running low, and their ammunition stockpiles were dwindling. The Allies, on the other hand, seemed to have an endless supply of both, and their air power was beginning to tell. The P-51 Mustang, with its sleek lines and powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, was a dominant force in the skies, capable of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory and taking on the best the Luftwaffe had to offer. As the battle raged on, the Allies began to gain the upper hand. Their tanks, supported by waves of infantry and backed up by artillery and air power, pushed the Germans back, inch by bloody inch. The Germans fought hard, but they were outnumbered and outgunned, and slowly but surely they were being driven back. The Allies' victory was by no means certain, but the momentum was with them, and they pressed their advantage, pushing the Germans back towards the Rhine. In the midst of this chaos, individual acts of heroism stood out, Moments of bravery and selflessness that would be read for generations to come. A young lieutenant, leading a platoon of infantry through the ruins of a shattered town, stumbled upon a group of wounded soldiers, left behind by the retreating Germans. Without hesitation, he rallied his men and led them in a desperate bid to rescue the wounded, fighting off snipers and machine gun nests as they went. It was a small act of courage, but one that would save countless lives, and inspire his comrades to fight on, no matter the cost. As the night wore on, the battle showed no signs of slowing, the two armies locked in a struggle that would determine the course of history. The Allies had the advantage, but the Germans were far from beaten, and the outcome was still very much in doubt. The world held its breath, waiting to see what the dawn would bring, and whether the Allies would be able to crush the German army once and for all. The stage was set for a final, decisive confrontation, one that would decide the fate of Europe and the future of humanity. Tanks burst through the enemy lines, cannons blazing. Infantry followed close behind, rifles firing in short bursts. The ground shook beneath their feet as artillery pounded the enemy's rear. Chaos erupted, men screaming, weapons firing, and smoke billowing everywhere. A squad of soldiers darted between the tanks, taking cover behind them as they advanced. Their lieutenant yelled above the din, directing them towards a strategic building. They reached it, poured inside, and cleared room by room. Each floor was a fierce battle, but they pushed on, driven by adrenaline and training. Outside, the battle raged on. Fighter jets screamed overhead, dropping bombs that exploded in massive fireballs. The enemy's anti-aircraft guns returned fire, but the jets were too fast, too agile. They dodged and weaved, coming back for another pass. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and oil. In the building, the soldiers fought their way to the rooftop. They burst through the door, guns ready, and were met with a hail of bullets. The enemy was waiting for them, pinned down behind barricades. The soldiers dove for cover, returning fire. The rooftop became a maelstrom of bullets, grenades, and screams. A soldier lobbed a grenade over the barricade, blowing it to splinters. The others surged forward, guns blazing. The enemy was quickly overwhelmed, and soon the rooftop was secure. The soldiers stood panting, surveying the carnage. The city stretched out before them, a landscape of ruin and smoke. The lieutenant's voice crackled over the radio. "Secure the perimeter! Hold this position!" The soldiers nodded, though he couldn't see them. They knew what to do. They set up a defensive position, ready to repel any counterattack. The battle was far from over, but they had won this small victory. As night began to fall, the city was bathed in an eerie glow. Fires burned everywhere, casting flickering shadows. The soldiers huddled together, waiting for the dawn. Hay knew the enemy would counterattack, and they steeled themselves for the fight ahead. The night was filled with the sound of gunfire, explosions, and screams. The battle never truly stopped, just ebbed and flowed like a tide. The soldiers slept in short, fitful bursts, always ready to jump back into the fray. They were the thin line between victory and defeat, and they knew it. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the soldiers stood ready. They had held their position through the night, repelling several fierce attacks. Now, they waited for the sun to rise, casting its pale light over the devastated city. The enemy was out there, waiting for its moment to strike. The soldiers knew it, and they steeled themselves for the final push. The once proud armies now lay shattered and still, the only sound the haunting silence that followed the brutality of war. The cries of the wounded and the dying had finally subsided, leaving an unsettling quiet that seemed to weigh heavily on the survivors. The air was thick with the stench of smoke, sweat, and blood, a noxious mixture that clung to every surface and seemed to sear itself into the lungs of all who breathed it in. As the last remnants of adrenaline began to wear off, the true extent of the devastation became starkly apparent. The casualty reports were staggering, with entire battalions reduced to mere handfuls of survivors. Medical corps worked tirelessly to tend to the wounded, but their efforts were often in vain, as the sheer number of casualties overwhelmed their capabilities. The cries for help still echoed through the desolate landscape, but they were fewer and farther between now, as if even the wounded had given up hope. The scale of the destruction was awe-inspiring in its brutality, with entire cities reduced to rubble and once green fields scorched and blackened by the relentless bombardment. As the sun began to set on the devastated landscape, the survivors stumbled through the wreckage, searching for any remnants of their former lives. They moved with a numbing sense of purpose, as if driven by a desperate need to find something, anything, that might provide a glimmer of hope in a world that seemed to have been torn asunder. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the occasional faint cry for help or the rumble of distant thunder, a reminder that even nature itself seemed to be mourning the loss of so much life. The commanders, those who had led their troops into the meat grinder, now wandered the battlefield, their faces etched with a mixture of grief and guilt. They had made the decisions, given the orders, and sent their men to their deaths. The weight of those choices hung heavy on their shoulders, and they couldn't help but wonder if there had been another way, some alternative, that might have spared their troops the carnage they had endured. But it was too late now. The battle was lost, and all that remained was to pick up the pieces and try to make sense of the senseless. As night began to fall, the survivors huddled together, trying to find comfort in the presence of others. They spoke in hushed tones, sharing what little news they had, and trying to come to terms with the magnitude of their loss. The stars twinkled above, a cruel reminder of the beauty and wonder that still existed in a world that seemed to have been torn apart by conflict. The darkness was almost palpable, a living, breathing entity that seemed to press in on them from all sides, threatening to consume what little was left of their sanity. In the distance, the sounds of sporadic gunfire could still be heard, a reminder that even in defeat, there were still those who refused to surrender. They were the last remnants of a once proud army, now reduced to a scattered handful of guerrilla fighters, determined to carry on the fight, no matter the cost. Their bravery was admirable, but ultimately futile, for they were fighting a losing battle, one that would eventually consume them all. And yet, they persisted, driven by a fierce determination to resist, to defy the enemy, and to cling to the hope that one day, their sacrifices would not be in vain. The night wore on, a long, dark, and endless expanse of time, filled with the sounds of sorrow, grief, and despair. The world seemed to have been turned upside down, and nothing would ever be the same again. The war had changed everything, leaving in its wake a trail of destruction, death, and devastation that would take generations to heal. And as the survivors stumbled through the wreckage, they couldn't help but wonder what the future held, and whether they would ever be able to rebuild and recover from the trauma they had endured. The silence was oppressive, a constant reminder of what had been lost, and the long, hard road that lay ahead. The aftermath of war leaves an indelible mark on the global landscape, reshaping the course of history in profound ways. The long-term geopolitical impact of such conflicts can be seen in the rise and fall of empires, the redrawing of national borders, and the emergence of new world powers. In the context of the war we've been analyzing, the consequences were far-reaching, influencing international relations, global economies, and societal structures for decades to come. The war served as a catalyst for significant geopolitical shifts, leading to the formation of new alliances and the dissolution of old ones. The balance of power was reset, with some nations emerging stronger and more influential, while others were left to pick up the pieces and rebuild. This rebalancing act had a ripple effect, impacting regional and global stability, as nations adjusted to their new positions within the international hierarchies. One of the most notable legacies of the war was the establishment of a new international order, predicated on the principles of collective security and cooperation. The creation of international institutions and treaties aimed at preventing future conflicts marked a significant departure from the pre-war era, where might made right and diplomacy often took a backseat to military prowess. This new order, though imperfect, has provided a framework for nations to resolve disputes without resorting to violence, thereby reducing the incidence of war and promoting global peace and security. However, the legacy of war is not solely defined by its geopolitical aftermath. The human cost, though often overshadowed by strategic analyses, is a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of conflict. The countless lives lost, families torn apart, and communities destroyed serve as a poignant testament to the enduring impact of war on human society. The psychological scars, the displacement, and the loss of cultural heritage are all elements of a darker legacy, one that underscores the need for empathy, understanding, and reconciliation in the aftermath of conflict. As we reflect on the legacy of war, it becomes clear that its impact extends far beyond the battlefield, influencing the fabric of our societies, our economies, and our very worldview. The question of how we choose to remember and learn from these conflicts is paramount, for it is in these choices that we find the potential for growth, for forgiveness, and for the prevention of future wars. In the end, the legacy of war challenges us to confront the duality of human nature, where our capacity for cooperation and compassion is juxtaposed with our propensity for violence and destruction. It is a sobering reminder that, Despite our advances in technology, diplomacy, and international law, the specter of war remains, a constant and haunting presence in our collective psyches. As we close this chapter on the history of war, we are left with a profound and chilling realization that the true horror of war is not the destruction it wreaks, but the darkness it reveals within ourselves. It is this darkness that we must acknowledge and confront, lest we forget the lessons of history and condemn future generations to relive the tragedies of the past. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this journey through the complexities of military history. I hope that our exploration has provided you with a deeper understanding of the subject and its ongoing relevance to our world today. If you'd like to explore more topics in military history, please subscribe to our channel for in-depth analyses, thought-provoking discussions, and insightful commentary on the conflicts that have shaped our world.